Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our 20th Zoom panel. Tonight, we have assembled an illustrious group of speakers who are here to bring to life the man, the artist, the work, and the exhibition devoted to Kamoda Shōji. While we do have many in our audience from Minnesota, given the world situation, the vast majority of you who are with us tonight are unable to see this extraordinary show in person. Indeed, we have nearly 600 registered viewers hailing from 20 countries, a record for us, from Australia, India, Nepal, New Zealand, and Japan to Scotland, France, Spain, Ukraine, Russia, and elsewhere. We have guests from 31 states, also a record for us, comprised of many curators, departmental chairs, conservators, museum directors from 21 museums around the world, plus numerous collectors, dealers, art appraisers, art history professors, and a remarkable number of clay artists as well. So tonight, the plan is for me, for the first time, to pass the moderator's hat over to Matthew Welch, without whom this seminal exhibition would never have taken place, nor the beautiful and insightful catalog ever get to print. As many of you know, Matthew Welch is the Mary Ingebrand Pollard Deputy Director and the Chief Curator of the Minneapolis Institute of Art. He has been with the museum since 1990, initially when I first met him as a curator of Japanese art before his current leadership role. Nowadays, he is involved in strategically building all aspects of the museum's global collections. And though his daily schedule can range from Botticelli to Anish Kapoor, he remains a passionate advocate for his first love, Japanese art. For this project, over many years, he drew on his passion, knowledge, and curatorial skills to make the show what it is today. Matthew has been devoted to making the show a reality, diligent in every aspect of bringing it to fruition, and perseverant in keeping Aaron Rio on board as curator-author, despite mid-project, Aaron having jumped ship to land at the Met. Matthew even charted smooth sailing during the change of Mia's museum directorship at a very key moment. It has been a labor of love for both of us. And thank you so much, Matthew, for making all of this a reality. So now I would like to turn the moderation duties over to him, and he will direct his questions to our speakers that will hopefully capture for you the mystery, the context, the beauty, and the genius of the man and his work, the renowned ceramist Kamoda Shōji. Matthew.
Joan, thank you so much for those kind words. It really is a labor of love, something so easy to do, actually, when you consider this artist and the incredible pieces he produced. I'm really delighted that we're able to do this today. Thank you so much for partnering with us to offer this webinar. And thank you all, wherever you are, for joining us. Before we begin, I wanted to introduce everyone so that we don't have to pause midstream in our discussions. This evening, we have Louise Court, who is the Director Emerita of Ceramics from the Freer-Sackler and Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C. She's an eminent scholar in the field who has authored several books. Most of us grew up in Japanese art, cutting our teeth on publications produced by Louise Court. To her credit is Shigaraki, Potter's Valley, Isamu Noguchi in Modern Japanese Ceramics, Seto Imino Ceramics, and Ceramics and Modernity in Japan. In 2012, Louise was awarded the Koyama Fujio Memorial Prize for her research on historical and contemporary Japanese ceramics. And she has also received the Smithsonian Distinguished Scholar Award. Also with us tonight is Shirley Rendell. Shirley is a passionate collector of Japanese ceramics from Boston, Massachusetts. She was born into an academic family and regularly went to the museum with her father. She worked for the director of the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, and then had a full-fledged career as a television journalist. With her husband and business partner, Kenneth Rendell, a well-known dealer in historical letters and documents, they built many great collections for their clients. But happily for us, she now collects for herself. Also, joining us tonight is, as Joan mentioned, Erin Rio, who is the Associate Curator in the Department of Asian Art at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, where he specializes in pre-modern Japanese painting and religious arts. He's currently preparing an exhibition that explores the arts of Japan through the lens of anxiety. We all look forward to that. Erin earned his PhD in art history from Columbia University in 2015, while serving as the Jane and Morgan Whitney Fellow at the Met. Before returning to the Met in 2019, he served as the Andrew W. Mellon Assistant Curator and later Associate Curator of Japanese and Korean Art here at the Minneapolis Institute of Art. And finally, the person in this lineup who really needs absolutely no introduction, you've just heard from JOAN Mirvis, is a renowned expert in Japanese art, specializing first, I think, in prints, also paintings, screens, and most especially contemporary ceramics for more than 40 years. She is the leading Western dealer in the field of modern and contemporary ceramics, and her New York gallery, JOAN Mirvis Ltd., exclusively represents top Japanese clay artists. She is also the co-founder of Asia Week New York, which is coming up, and served as its first president. So with that, I think we'll get started. I have a brief sort of explanation as to why in the world this exhibition is taking place in Minneapolis. If we could go to the first slide. So, you know, it's a locale that does present its challenges. This Bobcat was the welcome wagon to our lenders to the exhibition for the December opening of the exhibition. But our climate notwithstanding, there is a sizable population in Minneapolis and the surrounding state with a strong affinity to Japanese ceramics. Indeed, Stillwater, Minnesota was the location of Warren McKenzie's home and studio. McKenzie studied with Bernard Leach and in the late 1940s was heavily influenced by Shoji Hamada. He taught ceramics at the University of Minnesota for decades and produced so many students who worked in the Japanese folk style that they collectively came to be known as the Minge Soda contingent. 1 hour north of the Twin Cities, Richard Bresnahan, an apprentice of Nakazato Takashi in Karatsu, Japan, operates the largest climbing kiln in North America. Bresnahan, too, spent his entire career heightening awareness of Japanese ceramics and aesthetics through his classes at the university and by fostering an active fellowship program on the campus of St. John's. The Northern Clay Center, founded in 1990, is less than a mile from the museum here in Minneapolis and is a hotbed for ceramic activity. Historically, it's offered residencies to artists from around the world, including Satoru Hoshino and Eiko Kishi, who you see here on the screen. The Minneapolis Institute of Arts has been active in collecting and featuring Japanese ceramics in special exhibitions. Echizen, 800 Years of Japanese Stoneware, an exhibition organized by the Birmingham Museum of Art, filled our special exhibition hall in 1995. And in 2003, the museum hosted Shaped with a Passion, featuring 118 spectacular ceramics from the Weyerhaeuser collection in the art complex at Duxbury, Massachusetts, amassed in the 1970s. And we'll hear more about that from Louise Court later in the presentation. For its part, the museum has been a strong proponent of Japanese art, expanding its galleries twice in recent years, in 1998 and again in 2006, making it one of the largest displays in the United States, replete with rooms devoted to contemporary ceramics and teawares. MIA has also been the fortunate recipient of generous gifts and bequests from private collectors that have served to greatly build upon the acquisitions made by the curators. One thinks of the many marvelous gifts from Mary Griggs Burke and the Mary and Jackson Burke Foundation, David Frank and Kazukuni Sugiyama, Tamara and Michael Root, Bill and Elizabeth and Libby Clark, Carol and Jeffrey Horvitz, Joan and Fred Bakeland, and there's a long list that we don't, that I can't cover today. It was perhaps because of this high level of activity, expanded galleries, and significant community following around Japanese ceramics in Minneapolis that Joan Mirviss and Bob Levine first gifted 2 works of art to commemorate the expansion of the galleries in 2006, Lilies by Sugiura Yasuyoshi and Dream by Kakurazaki Ryuichi. And it was around this time that Joan revealed that she was contemplating a future home for her and her husband Bob's collection of works by Kamoda Shōji. The die was more fully cast in 2015 when she and Bob presented a work by Kamoda Shōji to the museum in commemoration of the 100th anniversary of its founding in 1915. That spirit of commitment has proceeded apace with 2 additional gifts from Joan and Bob upon the opening of the Art of Change, and 3 more that will be acquired next month. It is our hope that the balance of the Mirviss-Levine collection will eventually make its way permanently to the museum, but Joan tells me very firmly that will have to wait. Some things are too beautiful to part with. A freshly minted PhD from Columbia, Aaron immediately rolled up his sleeves and mounted an excellent exhibition, Boundless Peaks, about the Japanese ink painter Araki Minole, and another featuring the Mizusashis in the collection of Carol and Jeffrey Horvitz. In 2017, while formulating an exhibition of works by Japanese women ceramicists called Living Clay, Aaron also began planning for the long-discussed exhibition of works by Kamoda Shōji. And as Joan mentioned, Aaron departed MIA in 2019 to accept a position at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, but not before successfully securing a coveted slot on the museum's exhibition calendar, as well as reviewing works in American private collections and developing the exhibition checklist. And even while juggling his new responsibilities at the Met, he managed to provide us with an excellent essay that forms the core of the exhibition catalog. So as you all know, the exhibition opened at the Minneapolis Institute of Art on December 11th. On display are 49 works from 10 private collections nationwide. Strategically located off the main lobby, the exhibition ensnares, in a happy way, nearly every visitor who comes to the museum. The exhibition is divided into 3 sections. The first features Kamoda's early works produced between 1952 and 1968, and encompasses his time at university in Kyoto and his formative period in Mashiko, including his early forays into more sculptural work, as we see in this amazing faceted purple vase from 1968. The second section of the exhibition from 1969 to 1978 is the largest, revealing as it does Kamoda's prolific production. It opens, as you see here, with a small but spectacular vase with colored slip glazes from 1971. And at the other end of the exhibition continues with several examples from each phase that chronicle the breadth of his experimentation and production. Finally, Kamoda's final years from 1979 until his death in 1983 are represented by only 2 works from 1980, produced after his declining health forced him to relocate to Tokyo to be closer to medical care. So at this point, I'd like to begin the panel discussion, asking Aaron to tell us a bit about what he discovered in his research into Kamoda Shōji and how he emerged as from a veritable sea of Japanese ceramic artists and how he came to be such a pivotal force in the development of 20th century Japanese ceramics. Aaron.
Thank you, Matthew. And thanks to you and Joan for organizing this program, as well as your respective teams. It's an honor and a bit unnerving to be here among distinguished specialists and collectors of Japanese ceramics, like LOUISE CORT, I must say. The exhibition in Minneapolis includes nearly 50 works from American collections, spanning the 2.5 decades of Kamoda's brief but consequential career, from the mid-50s to the early 80s. It follows Kamoda as he moves eastward from his formative years in Western Japan. He was born in Osaka and trained in Kyoto, to the town of Mashiko in the Kanto region, and finally to the isolated village of Tono in far northeast Japan, where Kamoda lived and worked feverishly throughout the 1970s. He died tragically in 1983 at the age of 49 after a protracted illness. The exhibition concept, the art of change, we called it, was inspired by an impressive group of works recently collected in the US that together allow a presentation of Kamoda's extraordinary artistic vision for the first time outside of Japan. As others here tonight will describe, there have been many Kamoda retrospectives in Japan over the years, including one in Tokyo that opened at the Musée Tomo just as exhibition development was underway in Minneapolis. We settled on 50 works, 49 by Kamoda and a single work by his first teacher, the eminent ceramic artist Tomimoto Kenkichi. Except for a small group of rare early works, the rest date to an exceptionally vibrant, innovative period from 1966 to 1980, Kamoda's final years in Mashiko and his entire decade in Tono. I'm showing you here just 3 examples of his work from that period, all 3 in the exhibition. A wide-mouthed vessel from 1967 at left. This is late in his time in Mashiko. In the middle, a vase from 1974. Now he's settled here in Tono. And then at right, a small vase from one of his final shows that Matthew just mentioned, wrapped in diamonds of lustrous blue, green, and black enamel. The exhibition ends with 2 pieces from this 1980 show. From the beginning, we imagined this exhibition and catalog as an opportunity for close looking, a concentration of nearly 50 works from 1966 to 1980, and an abundance of scholarship already carried out in Japan allowed us to plot a slow, steady look at an artist working at his peak. We watch him test and try and probe for 15 years, each work positioned in a series of overlapping technical and stylistic experiments carried out over months or a few years at most. It's a tireless exploration of form, material, and surface, driven by a single-minded pursuit of newness and of change. Kamoda specialists have long acknowledged the influence of his early teacher, Tomimoto Kenkichi, on Kamoda's practice. And it was important for us to include just one work by Tomimoto, not the one I'm showing you here, alongside a resonant work by Kamoda, as a way of hinting at the important role he played, especially in Kamoda's formative years. Tomimoto, who just started teaching in Kyoto when Kamoda arrived, and was, as it happens, an acquaintance of the family, encouraged his students to think of themselves as designers first and foremost, and he championed the pursuit of innovation above all else. The exhibition begins with 2 very early works, both from the late 1950s, right around the time of his move to Mashiko. I'm showing it right here, one of those 2 works next to a vase, Kamoda's graduation piece, which is in the collection of his alma mater, the Kyoto City University of the Arts. There's a subtle echo that I enjoy of the graduation work in this vase at right, which is why I'm showing it here. The primary decorative motif, this shape that sort of spirals around the vertical axis, is a clearer suggestion of depth on the surface of the vessel, and one that he returns to periodically throughout his career, and I would suggest in an increasingly painterly way, especially as we approach the mid-70s. Tomimoto also played a practical role in his students' budding career. After graduation, he secured for Kamoda a position with a company in Ibaraki Prefecture, producing mass-market ceramics. Kamoda seems to have had nothing positive whatsoever to say about the 2 years he spent there, but it's clear that he greatly expanded both his technical capability and his connections in the region during this period. In 1958, he quit his job, left his young family, and moved to Mashiko in nearby Tochigi. He rented a climbing kiln there in 1959. Kamoda reveled in the degree of independence possible in this rural and important center of ceramics production, best known for its association with another potter, another shoji, Kamoda Shōji. Kamoda's 8 years in Mashiko brought him acclaim and financial security, but by 1969, he was clearly looking for an escape from the relative buzz of Mashiko. That year, he began exploring northeastern Japan. On one trip, in the isolated village of Tono, 250 miles northeast of Mashiko, he was introduced by a potter to the unique local clay, unsuitable for the wheel and full of bits and pieces of minerals. 2 standout works from late in 1968 anchored this part of the exhibition and really set the stage for the core focus on the final decade. Made just before his move to Tono in 1969, they represent an important pivot toward hand-built forms consisting primarily of flat planes and an increasing interest in the tension between surface decoration and form. The design of this large plate, for example, pivots on the push and pull between the decoration of the face on one hand and of the irregular hexagonal shape and form on the other. I'll end here with just a few views of another standout piece from late 1968, a vase that we will see several times tonight, and that consists of a series of triangles that appear to be stitched together to form a less than stable whole. The work is full of movement and energy. It becomes a new vase at every angle. And we'll pick this up a bit later on, but for now, I'll turn it back to Matthew.
Thank you, Aaron. That was incredible. We'll return to you in a little bit, but now I want to ask a question of Louise. LOUISE CORT and Sam Morse traveled to Japan in the early 1970s on behalf of Carl Weyerhaeuser to investigate and purchase works directly from artists at their kiln site. Louise, can you tell us about your experiences in Japan, and particularly your meeting with Kamoda Shōji?
With pleasure, Matthew. The path to my single but incredibly memorable meeting with Kamoda Shōji began with this red raku tea bowl. Carl Weyerhaeuser, who lived in Duxbury, Massachusetts, and founded the Art Complex Museum in Duxbury, bought this bowl attributed to the raku workshop founder Chojiro, working in the late 16th century, on a trip to Japan. Carl knew Sam Morse, a local high school student who had just returned from a year in Japan. And that Sam is our Sam Morse, now professor of Japanese art history at Amherst College. I was working newly as assistant curator of Oriental art at the Fogg Art Museum. Through Sam, Carl invited me to visit to see his small collection of antique Japanese ceramics. I remember commenting to Carl that the raku workshop, amazingly, was still active after 4 centuries, and he might consider acquiring a tea bowl made by each generation of the workshop, and even meeting the current 16th generation master. Soon, Carl and Sam were planning a trip to Japan to visit living potters. This was 1972, and there were very few published resources about working potters and where to find them. In the Harvard Yenching Library, Sam found a compact 3-volume set published by the ceramics dealer Kuroda Ryoji. All in black and white and all in Japanese, this set showed mugshots of potters and a few examples of their work. Most importantly, it gave their addresses. You see it over on the far left of this slide. Somehow, Carl picked out the potters he wanted to meet. That first trip was a huge success, and immediately plans were laid for a second one the following year. At the last minute, Carl was unable to participate, and so I was invited to take his place. That is how, on September 6, 1973, Sam and I and our logistic collaborator, Mr. Hazu, went to Mashiko. After our first visit with Shimaoka Tatsuzo in his elegantly refurbished farmhouse, we headed to meet Kamoda Shōji. Now I'd like to read from the notes I compiled after that unforgettable visit. The lady taxi driver drove us as far as she could down the road to Kamoda Shōji's place until it became utterly impassable, at which point she let us out to walk. Eventually, we reached what seemed to be a barnyard, with black chickens darting to and fro and the tea bushes planted as hedges along the path. Kamoda's dilapidated house showed signs of the presence of small children, a tiny pair of sneakers in the entryway, and hard use. He came down a long passageway to meet us, wearing blue jeans and a blue pullover with wireframe glasses and rumpled hair. After bringing us tea in some of his own cups, porous gray and wonderful to hold, he asked us what we wanted and smiled bemusedly when we said we wanted pots. He brought out 5 pieces for us to look at, but he sat silently until Sam's gregariousness aroused his interest and changed him into a warm and enthusiastic talker. He expressed the wish that we were going to be around longer so that he could take us deeper into the mountains and introduce us to various young potters in their 20s who had set up independent workshops and were keeping themselves going by supplying typical Mashiko ware to the tourist shops in the town, while having time and space for their personal experiments. Sam, Mr. Hazu, and Kamoda fell to reminiscing about Osaka, since Kamoda comes from Kishiwada, the roughest area of the city. But I hate Kansai, he stated. Talk also turned to the European trip with Professor Mikami, from which he had just returned. His impressions of the Northern European craftsmen whom he had visited, and his feeling, shared by many other potters we talked to, that Japan is small and fussy, that there is little room for grand long-term undertakings. Kamoda studied at Kyoto Art College under Tomimoto Kenkichi, although apparently there had been a falling out between the two. Several years ago, while continuing to live in Mashiko, he set up a workshop in Tono, Iwate Prefecture, because I like the place. He has 2 annual shows, one in the spring at Takashimaya and one in the autumn at the Green Gallery in Aoyama. Each year, he picks a particular glaze scheme and applies it to all the pieces he makes that year. From photographs, I had guessed that his work would be monumental. Actually, they were fairly small, just a convenient size to shape by hand, as he does. 3 of the pieces were of unglazed clay in smooth asymmetrical shape, decorated with lines of alternating punch holes and opalescent glaze dots. The other 2 were in red clay with swirling stripe patterns. They unfortunately were already promised to someone. We chose 2 gray pieces of great elegance, and these 2 pieces you're seeing now. But I wanted to show you the second piece in a better modern photograph so you appreciate the amazing effect of form, texture, color, pattern that I think is unequaled by anyone else that can be seen in Kamoda's work. I'd also like to show you on the left, the base of that same pot, so that you can see that Kamoda was very diligent about recording the series of his work. There is the number 1973 written vertically on the right-hand side, together with his signature. And on the box for the piece, he also includes the date 1973 and just calls it a jar. As a kind of postscript, I'd like to step backward a little bit in time to 1966, when the first Japan Art Festival exhibition appeared in New York City and then traveled around the United States. It was an exhibition not of pottery as such, not of functional vessels, but of sculpture and painting. And it's very interesting that Kamoda was among the few artists working in clay who was chosen to participate. Among the others were Yagi Kazuo and the very young Suzuki Osamu of Mino. Victor and Taka Haugi, who were 2 collectors of Japanese art, bought 2 of Kamoda's dishes out of that exhibition and fortunately gave them to the Sackler Gallery in 2010. One is this dish with ash glaze, typical of Kamoda's early work, and the other is an unglazed piece. Already in this dish, however, you see Kamoda's masterful way of working with the thickness of the clay, with the edges, with the relationship of volume and space that I think is really unmatched anywhere. And last, I even want to show you that the bases of his pieces are extraordinarily beautiful, with a balance in the way he places the carved foot rim in the middle. And you can see his tiny seal just above the edge of the foot. Thank you. That's my story, Matthew.
Thank you, Louise. And I'm in awe of the meticulousness and precision of your notes from that era. Thank you so much for sharing.
I wrote them for Carl Weyerhaeuser because he couldn't be with us.
There we are. So next I'd like to ask Joan, Joan, you've been collecting works by Kamoda for 30 years. far in advance of many other American collectors, although now we know clearly not everyone. Carl Weyerhaeuser had to jump on you. How did this come about? What was it about his work that initially captivated you and clearly continues to fascinate you to today?
Thank you, Matthew. I'm really so excited to be here tonight and to hopefully inspire others with my passion for the work of Kamoda Shōji. My first introduction to Japanese clay really came about, in fact, because of Louise, I should say, because of the show called Japanese Ceramics Today that was at the Museum of Natural History at the Smithsonian in 1983. And there was a Kamoda work in that show, and I'm embarrassed to say it didn't resonate at all. I didn't notice it. I don't remember where it was in the exhibition, but that's not what caught my eye at that point in time. But the show was so important to me. When I went to Japan the next year in 1984, I pulled every string I had to meet the amazing Kikuchi Tomo and her daughter Misao, who were the patronesses of that show and truly of the field, and also from Ibaraki themselves. So the artists of that region of Japan were always important to both of them. And as I think Erin mentioned, there was recently a show at her museum. She is unfortunately no longer with us, on Kamoda Shōji. So it took her and her heirs quite a long time to put the show together that Matthew and Erin have put together for us here in America. However, when I was in Japan in 1987, I would always go to every museum exhibition that I could. And you see the cover of a catalog at the upper section for a show in 1987. Kamoda was deceased for only 4 years, and already the National Museum in Tokyo, which is called the Koge-kan, it's the craft division, put on a solo retrospective, and I was completely blown away. I went back, I believe 4 times, but certainly 3 times. And the final time I went, I brought my friend Kusaka Chieko, who is a 3rd-generation Chinese antiquities dealer in Tokyo, who actually liked clay of all different ilks. And she too was completely shocked at this show. So when she was there with me, we played the usual game. Okay, if we had all the money in the world, which piece would we take home? And I looked at a lot of things, and I could see a lot of them were in museums, so I couldn't actually try and break the doors down of the Kyoto National Museum. I fell in love with this purple vase, and you see here on the right the illustration from the catalog. So Chieko, because she is who she is, she's really the cement that holds me and Japan together. Of course, knew Murata Shiro, who was the heir to a gallery called Mune Gallery, Mune Toge-kan. And that gallery was defunct at that point in time. But the heir to that, the shop director, went on and opened his own gallery called Murata. And I sat with him and her, and we went through the catalog, and I said, I want this purple one. And of course, this was during the bubble when prices were insane and there were so many zeros, especially in yen, I couldn't even count them. And if he said yes, and he could get it for me, I really couldn't afford it anyway, but I made my request. And it turned out that this was one of the works that the predecessor gallery had actually sold. It had been displayed at Monet Gallery. So I was patient. I was patient because this was just one of those intellectual, passionate exercises. If you could have all the money in the world, what would you get? I never actually thought I was going to get it, but maybe it was the translation. Mr. Murata thought I really wanted it and could afford to buy it, and he pursued it, and eventually I did. So what I didn't know at the time was how important a work it was. I just loved it. But you see in the upper right, in 1975, when Kamoda was alive and well, there was a major book, series of books on Japanese ceramics called Gendai no Toge. And there was one volume, and in this volume 12, there's works only by Yagi Kazuo, Suzuki Osamu, the 2 founders of the soldation movement, and this man. And this piece was given this enormous illustration, and like colors off, but what can we say? Color correction in those days was a different art. And then it proceeded to be published many, many times. And then once I owned the piece after 1995, it had to go back, because any exhibition of Kamoda Shōji's work was incomplete without this piece, because there was only one. And as Aaron has so beautifully described, it's faceting, its texture, it's, as he said perfectly, it looks stitched together with these little dots going up and down like a pair of blue jeans. It really spoke volumes about where the man was about to go. This was the high dive that he was about to go off. And you see in Matsubara Sensei's book for the Kyoto National Museum show in 2005, it is given pride of place within the book as the dividing line between the early work and the mature work. So now I have this responsibility. I own this piece, and it has to go back and forth to Japan. So the first time I insisted that I was going to hand carry it for a Yokobori show at the Mashiko Messa. No one was going to touch it. I would carry it. And the second time in 2005, Matsubara got the money together to be a courier. He came to New York, he picked it up, he brought it back to Japan, and he hand carried it back. So Matthew, the piece is now with you. It will not rest with you for a long period of time, but I look forward to one day making its final home, Minneapolis. This piece also came through Murata, and I believe that this and the other were from the same collector. It's Japan. You never really know what's going on and who owns what or how you get it. But this was another favorite piece of mine in that exhibition. And within a year, I had that. And I should also mention that the timing was perfect. Part of the reason that I was able to buy these pieces was the Japanese bubble, economic bubble had burst, and that the astronomical prices of the 1980s had diminished, and my fortunes could now accommodate the current market price, which was, of course, felicitous. As no one has said yet, but maybe someone will say, Kamoda Shōji's exhibitions were so popular in their time that people lined up before the doors opened, whether it was at Takashimaya or Aoyama Green Gallery, and pieces would literally, people would take the price card, go running out the door, and things would often trade hands afterwards. So when I came on the scene, Kamoda was only deceased 10 or 12 years. And then as time went on, 20 years. So the people who had manically, passionately stood in line to get these pieces show after show after show were slowly perhaps passing away. The children had the piece, but it took quite some time for top quality pieces to come on the market in the 2000s. But what I had to do was network. And I'm sure everyone on this panel understands Japan is a networking country. You can't, well, I guess Louise just knocked on the door to meet Mr. Kamoda, but I don't have that kind of clout to knock on the door. So it's who you know. And I was introduced to a collector in Nagoya who's no longer with us also. And I was able to buy this key piece from this collector. And it's truly one of my favorites. I show you the slide on the right. And for those of you who are collectors and there are labels on your pieces, please do not peel them off. Do not take them off. This is how we can tell that this piece in the very important show in 1971 was what Kamoda thought was worth being number 2 in the show. And generally speaking, the artists, even the artists today, tell me the top 10 pieces given the 1, 2 through 10. And then the numbers go down. So if you have a piece with a single digit number, you know the artist esteemed the piece themselves. And from this man in Nagoya, I was able to acquire further works. And here I show you, these are 2 works, not 3 works. The white porcelain vase and the piece on the left were done the same exact year for the same exact show. And you see him playing with the idea of a butterfly and how he is resolving it on a porcelain cylindrical piece versus a triangular stoneware piece, showing you the creativity and the dynamism and the variety that this man is contriving and playing with within a few month period. That is so extraordinary. And both of these belong to this other collector, and now they both belong to me, and I therefore wish to keep them together. I think it's important. So as I am collecting these Japanese ceramics by Kamoda, I am also a dealer, and I work from my home, and many of you who are here tonight may have been in my home, but these were never, ever on view. Even if you came for dinner, they were not on view because I was too nervous to put them on view and just felt I was the caretaker for a period of time and they should stay in their boxes. However, my clientele before Shirley weren't in the league to go spend $20,000, $30,000, $40,000 in 2000 something on contemporary Japanese clay. So when I acquired a piece and I thought the time was right to start getting Americans to collect, I approached collectors who were not collectors of Japanese clay. So the piece on the left was acquired by a collector of Indian and Nepalese sculpture, who also did contemporary Chinese ceramics. And for him, $30,000, $40,000 was not a significant amount of money, and he understood it immediately. There was no question. And the person on the right is a huge collector of contemporary Western art, very important patroness in many museums. And in both cases, for these two individuals, Kamoda became a stepping stone to look at other artists. They started with Kamoda. Most of my clients get to Kamoda later, but these people got it. And now I'm showing you three works. One you saw in the background behind Shirley, or you will see behind Shirley coming up. And you see another work in the Horvitz collection, and then my work that I acquired quite a long time ago. So as I transitioned, if you will, from collector to now promoter of the artist's work, I was lucky enough to continue to find works in the same sort of ilk from the same body of work. And now we can have this dialogue with multiple examples from the same type of material in American collections, and now beautifully displayed in Minnesota. I personally have derived much pleasure and gratification from the joy of Kamoda's work, especially when they're bought by my American clients. Through the years, I've been remarkably fortunate to have brought over 80 of his works to this country. And given where I was back in 1987 as this young beginning dealer on the floor of the Museum of Modern Art, Tokyo, I just find it utterly amazing that we are where we are today. And so I'm very grateful to those collectors in Japan who let me become the next owner of these works, and to my American collectors who have enabled me to afford to have done this. So thank you very much, and I turn the microphone back over to Matthew.
Thank you, Joan. My takeaway from that is that you are a tireless and determined collector and a formidable competition in the marketplace. I would not like to go up against you. So next, I would like to turn to Shirley Rendell. And Shirley, you know, it was clear from my conversations with you when you braved our Minnesota blizzard to come to the opening that you are passionate about Kamoda's work. You've managed to acquire several pieces. In fact, I think there are 6 of your works in the exhibition. How has owning them impacted your own collecting experience?
Thank you, Matthew. I think I'll start off with my passion. And the answer to that is complex. Just as Kamoda is complex, there's chemistry, to be sure. There's a shared belief in the importance of surface decoration and the unity of form and design. There's awe at his ability to generate new ideas and his technical skill in carrying them out. Yet I think there's something else. Kamoda was passionate about his work. He put his heart and soul into it. I believe this comes through not at us, but upon us. His passion engenders a passion in us. That's certainly been true of me. This is the first Kamoda work I ever saw. I immediately responded to his energy. I love the color and the design. I turned to JOAN MIRVISS. I was in her gallery and I said, who is this? I love it. I would really like to have this in my collection. Well, collectors will appreciate what happened next. JOAN regretfully said it was sold. For a collector, that is the dreaded word, sold. At least I got an introduction to Kamoda. This piece is now in the exhibition at MIA. The couple who acquired it lent it to the show, and I had the pleasure of seeing it again, of meeting them and telling them that this was the work that inspired me to learn more about the artist, to look, to read, and to eventually acquire a few works myself. This is the first piece I was able to acquire. I think it took me less than the proverbial 2 minutes to make the decision. There are two reasons I like it. The first is how this wave pattern from 1972 with alternating bands of inlaid slip encircles the vessel and how the edge of the mouth corresponds to it. Secondly, this stoneware vessel is a perfect example of the abrupt changes in style, form, and technique which characterize Kamoda's work and which I admire. This work represents change or a new idea. For the previous 2 years, Kamoda was producing a wave pattern with carved ridges, which was so popular, he probably could have sold it for the rest of his life. Yet he didn't care about the marketplace. He cared about staying fresh. I like the symbolism of the fact that my first acquisition was from a moment of innovation. One of the last variations on his popular wave pattern is this elegant undulating version from 1973. For me, in art as in life, I like subtleties. I like for a relationship, say with an art object, to go beyond the first impression, to unfold over time, and to have staying power. To me, this is so often true with Kamoda. With this quiet but strong work, I appreciate the shadowing, which he painted above and below the incised lines. This reminds me that Kamoda's talent was originally spotted as a painter. Then at university, he abruptly changed to become a ceramic artist. As for this piece, it is the last of that popular wave pattern. This work from 1973 with slip and glaze decoration is interesting to me because it shows Kamoda experimenting with a new flask-like form and a new design. I call it calligraphy because it seems to me to have the flow and personal expression of calligraphy, and I like calligraphy. In his introduction to the MIA catalog, Aaron Rio describes Kamoda as working through the decade of the 70s and early 80s at an almost frenetic pace as he experimented with forms, surfaces, techniques, and glazes. Within a year, sometimes within 6 months, there would be an interesting modification or something entirely new. His loyal fans anticipated this. A new series was a ceramic event. People lined up in advance, and had I been a collector then, I would have lined up also. This is a work I would definitely have chosen had I been at the Green Gallery in Tokyo in October 1976, when Kamoda's latest works became available. Those who followed his work would have noticed immediately the tapered cutouts of the mouth and the base as a new idea, as well as the glaze and enamel decoration. I love the way the notches communicate with the curve of the design and how they lighten and create a synthesis with the tubular form. This vessel has the appearance of a vase, but Kamoda did not believe that ceramics, even with a functional shape, had to have a practical use. They could be the result of an artist's self-expression. This too was an innovative idea at the time, and I agree. These last two pieces illustrate a unique collecting situation with Kamoda. With so much change and so many phases, collecting Kamoda is like collecting six different people all at once. As a collector, I have never felt compelled to acquire every phase of an artist's career, only what I like, and especially only what I want to live with in my home. With Kamoda, I like everything. Actually, there are not that many opportunities to acquire new works, so I have a distinct memory of acquisition for each one. The circumstances are a part of my history with this artist. A favorite memory of acquisition is this footed platter from 1977. One day, my daughter, who is a potter, studied Japanese in high school and college, and taught in Japan, and who is actually the genesis of this collection, was with me in Joan's gallery when I spied this work. I liked it, and I said, Julia, what do you think? Mom, that's cool, she said. Cool is not a curatorial descriptive, as she well knows, but between the two of us, this is and always will be a cool piece in addition to its other merits, a wonderful memory of acquisition. In 2019, the Musée Tomo in Tokyo held an exhibition of Kamoda's ceramic art. As we are in Hawaii in the summer, it was easy enough to go, and I couldn't resist. Seeing the best examples of each phase was so powerful. I went every day I was in Tokyo and one day twice. What struck me as I became accustomed to seeing one masterpiece after the next was how physically seeing them all together clearly told the story, his story of change. And this gave me an idea. At home in Boston, my growing collection was scattered throughout the house. Yet the larger story, beyond the synthesis of form and surface, was the art of change. So out went the living room. I gave away the furniture. And during the lockdown phase of COVID, I designed a room where I could display all of Kamoda's work together, along with other pieces from my collection. Now, on a daily basis, I can appreciate his evolving creativity, as well as his work in relation to other artists. Creating this room and having more space prompted me to acquire two early works, the ash glazed one from the 1950s, around the time Kamoda was a student, and the iron glazed one from the 1960s, around the time he was in Moscow before moving to Tono. As the daughter of an educator, I am always interested in the influence of teachers. Usually I place this 1936 white Subu by Tomimoto near Kamoda's work, as he was highly influential in his ceramic development, as we have heard. When Kamoda entered the Kyoto City University of Arts in 1952, the ceramics program was new, only 2 years old. The head of it, Tomimoto, imparted to his students the importance of originality. He was famous for saying, "Don't make a pattern of a pattern." If ever there was a student who didn't make a pattern of a pattern, it was Kamoda. I would like to end with these two pieces from one of my favorite series. They represent a rare moment of apparent acquisition indecision, but I quickly realized it wasn't a lack of decisiveness, but overwhelming appreciation of both works. I am glad to have them both because side by side, they demonstrate Kamoda's investigation of how to construct and design with enamel work on two different forms. They are both from 1978, but sold in separate sales that year. The one on the right is from the April sale. I like the rough versus elegant aspect of this, the way the clay with its high mineral content, clearly visible, contrasts with the gleaming horizontal bands of colored enamel. I like the six-sided form and how the mouth and base are notched to intersect with the enamel design on three sides. The one on the left wins my heart, though, for the way Kamoda suddenly decided to cover the entire body with vertical blue, yellow, and white lines of enamel. This was in the October sale. You still see the clay, and the mouth is wonderful, but when I first saw this work, I noticed the high faceted shoulders. This work is from 1978, but the faceting took me back to 1968 and Joan's breakthrough purple glaze work. I want to close by saying how humble I feel that I can live with these works by Kamoda in my home, and how delighted I was to be able to share some of them with Mia. Many thanks to Mia for their insightful exhibition, and many thanks to JOAN MIRVISS for the introduction to Kamoda. Matthew?
Thank you, Shirley, and thank you for so generously lending them to us. I have to say, you know, your sensitive eye and really astonishing powers of description and formal analysis make you a joy to listen to. If you're ever interested in a curatorial residency, there's a place for you here at MIA. Really wonderful.
Thank you.
So, Erin, I want to return to you. You know, you of all people know that at MIA, we're very fond about identifying the big idea for an exhibition as we work to formulate the show. What is the big idea in this exhibition?
the big ideas change. As I mentioned previously, the exhibition was designed, in my mind anyhow, to encourage close looking from the beginning, something that felt especially important, given the vibrant ceramic scene in Minneapolis and the region. So I would like to pick up where we were before. We pick back up with this little wobbly little vessel wrapped in wave-like patterns of green, red, and white slip. The waves don't so much flow together, but they sort of bump against one another. And at every angle, they trick the eye by dragging the form down or pulling it up or exposing its bulges. You can see several other examples with this same wave patterning set out in front of Kamoda in this photo at right. We're going to move through this pretty quickly. And his interest in these waves lasts for several years, as Shirley said. Some are in size. We saw one of those. Others are inlaid. These three works from 1972, which we've seen, are displayed side by side in the exhibition and feature three variations of inlaid light brown waves over a rough mottled gray surface. Then briefly, what were once waves, at least to me, appear to separate. It's as if we've zoomed in to get a look through an overall net-like pattern to see beyond it a landscape of meticulously rendered dots that play with the irregular surface of the vessel. Elsewhere, such as this work at right from 1974, these same motifs somehow seem to have gone rogue. They dance across and are framed by the flat front of the vessel. Like Shirley and others, this was also my first Kamoda work. There are 6 works in the show created in 1975 and 76, culminating in this powerful rust red vase, another highlight of the exhibition. You can't really help but want to touch it. And I want to use it. And that's not curatorial either, but it's true. We are still looking more or less here at this wave, or what I call net pattern, depending on whether you're focused on the white or red parts of the vase. But he again tries wrapping the vessel in patterns that seem to ignore the form entirely. They spill over the lip and foot, and along with this sort of strong white component up top, they stretch the vessel vertically. These three works are the precursors to that red vase from 1975, in this case, all featuring blue enamel decoration in combination with grays, light blues, and ochre. And then in that same case in the exhibition for scale, we match these 4 moderately sized vases with 2 final works, a small tea bowl and a large sturdy vase, both of which feature tilted wave patterns, now something more akin to ribbons draped across the body at challenging angles. Again, one definitely wants to drink tea from this tea bowl, if only to see the inside of the opposing lip, a place on the vessel where Kamoda often offers some kind of delicious visual surprise. These same 2 vases we've seen from 1976 anchor a group of 17 works created between 1976 and early 1979. This section of the exhibition traces a series of experiments whereby the surface of the vessel becomes a canvas on which he draws elements with incised contour lines and then describes them using primarily blue, gray, white, and occasionally red enamel. At the same time he does this, he begins testing these notches that Shirley mentioned and cutouts placed at 2 or 4 points of the foot and around the mouth. I think they have a profound effect on the way we ultimately perceive the vessels. So for example, with this vase at right, the attenuated notches at top and bottom emphasize the vase's cinched waist and give the sense of the vase as being squeezed at the middle and splitting open at either end. We'll move a bit more quickly here. There are 2 variations from 1977 here where the blue ribbons interact with these vertical lines and small red shapes that sort of float across the surface of the vessel. This vase we've seen, it was acquired by Minneapolis in 2015, and we put it on view shortly thereafter in 2016. It features similar shapes, I called them kites for a while, now striped, that float across the surface of the vessel, lifted and pulled around corners as if caught in the wind. 2 more, like surely one of my favorites is this platter at left from 1977, and at right, a very tall vase. In both, instead of kites now, there are these thin ribbons, still with the same incised contour lines and enamel stripes. I imagine that this ribbon has just sort of been dropped down from above in the case of the platter. Finally, a work that I think is a real triumph and that plays a central role in my essay for the catalog and sort of informed the design of the exhibition, really. Here are the striped enamel ribbons that we just that we just saw define circular shapes that look like bubbles bouncing and overlapping as they float upward along the vessel. Note the notches at the foot, which work with this beautifully adorned mouth to stretch the form vertically, contributing to a surprising sense of lightness and effervescence and upward movement. The catalog is loaded with big glossy details of this particular vase, all shot by the talented Dan Dennehy in Minneapolis, who also provided all of these images. Thank you very much. And finally, I'll end with these two vases, exactly where Shirley ended, in fact, made months after the previous work, now partially encased in enamel bands. The vase at right to me is a wonderful echo of the purple multifaceted vase from 1968. Here, the enamel stripes appear again to be stitched together, and in this case, onto the vessel itself. Thank you.
Thank you, Aaron. Yeah, just extraordinary. And there was a question that came in about the relative scale of these, and it's been mentioned several times. They're not of huge scale. The purple vase that Joan talked about is about 8 inches tall. The red one that we've seen repeatedly from Michael and Tamara Roots is about 7 inches tall. Others reach 18 inches or so, but that's on the tall side. So Joan, I'd like to return to you to sort of wrap up the discussion by asking you about Kamoda's impact on the field of Japanese ceramic production. In your assessment, what is his legacy?
Thank you, Matthew. And I'm going to whip through some of these slides because everyone has spoken so eloquently about his aesthetic. And we've talked about Tomimoto to some degree, but I just wanted to reiterate that Tomimoto's legacy is profound. And I think we're still living with his legacy today, starting in the 1920s. And Kamoda was one of his major pupils. And in many ways, I think no one would disagree with me that he's the ultimate embodiment of all the credos that Tomimoto made celebrated. One, which is an emphasis on creativity. This is an opposition to the way ceramics have been made up to that point in Japan, where one reproduced or followed the lines of one's ancestor or one's region or one's style, rather than break free from the mold and do something completely different. The axiom, do not make pattern from pattern, exists still today. Tomimoto further emphasized the importance of nature and the role of nature as a source of inspiration rather than nature as strictly a representation. And you can see here with this beautiful box by Tomimoto, which is now in the Carol and Jeffrey Horvitz collection, and this piece by Kamoda, which I juxtaposed in my Tomimoto exhibition. It's the Kamoda piece I had for many years. And actually, in quite honesty, when we set up the show, I had never thought to put these two things together. And it's just by coincidence, there they were, and I had the light bulb went off. And I understood what Kamoda was trying to do and how he's reinterpreting his teacher's work in a new way, to take the box, just get rid of the cover, you decorate the edge and the mouth, and you bring the design all the way down in a rather new, startling way with his new slip glaze patterning versus the polychrome enamel work of his teacher. And Tomimoto's design, as you can see, the impact here, Tomimoto's emphasis upon abstraction and also upon form. And Kaneko Kenji, one of the great scholars and connoisseurs of Japanese contemporary clay, has framed Tomimoto as the ultimate arbiter of form. And I would argue that Kamoda far exceeded his teacher in this respect. And as others have pointed to this window of time between 1976 and 1978, you see 4 very different works, including the little thing on the bottom, which is a sake cup that's 1.5 inches tall, but yet it has the power of something that's 14 or 15 inches tall. And reinterpreting blue enamel glaze in countless numbers of permutations with soft undulating forms, angled forms, squared forms, and functional forms in stoneware, in porcelain, and constantly reinventing himself. To go back to Shirley's, she had to think about it too long piece. And what was she thinking? Why was this hard? I love this piece. I love the, as Aaron has also so artfully described, the tension between the linear banding and the rough-hewn clay of Tono where he was living, the cutting, the base and the mouth running in opposite patterns. The tension between form and surface is maybe no more palpably so than in this magical piece. So, okay, where did all of this training bring us to today? I would say Wadamori Hiro, who died young in 2008, was seen by the Japanese to be the next Kamoda Shōji. And here you're seeing 4 works from 1992. Wada was Tomimoto's final pupil. And there was quite a period of time between Kamoda and Wada's apprenticeship with Tomimoto, but yet they came away with, I think, a very similar perspective. And here you have just one of many, many, many patterns that Wada adorned vessels of all different sizes within 1 year and 1 show to create a panoply of design and form and a dialogue between form and design, making each piece seem unique. Also notice the foot and the mouth. Those were very important to Kamoda. The foot and the mouth are always essential to the piece, and often the most interesting part of a Kamoda piece is the foot and how he resolves the glaze and the patterning at the base. And Wada was the great adherent to that tradition. Kuriki Tatsuke, and also a pupil of Tomimoto, but it's very difficult to say, okay, this is from Tomimoto and this is from Kamoda, but I would believe that Tomimoto's credo was more in words, and his impact and his aesthetic sensibility is better perceived in the works of Kamoda Shōji and then digested through Kamoda into the next generation. Kuriki, unfortunately, stopped working in 1990 to start being focused on his teaching at Kyoto City University of the Arts. But yet you can see with the variation of his works in his short career, a propensity for form versus pattern and the tension thereof, a huge focus on the mouth and the resolution of the patterning as it cascades down the form. Here you have 2 Kamodas from one of the most sought after period in his career, 1972, and 3 people you might not associate with being influenced. All 2 of them, Mori no Taime and Mayashita Zenji, are from Kyoto and are part of the Niten tradition, but yet the choice of color, the idea of wrapping the landscape, the patterning around the form, the importance of the mouth, the foot, the elevated foot, descends from Kamoda. And the piece on the lower left, I think maybe even Louise wouldn't recognize as being the work of the very celebrated Bizen unglazed rough stoneware artist Mori Togaku. Togaku and Esaki Ise and Kamoda worked together on a series of shows over a period of 4 years. And the cross-fertilization, I think, was very palpable from all 3 of the men's point of view. These shows were in Gallery Teikotsu Kaikan, Tokyo in 1969, 1970, and 1971. When I sent a picture of this tea bowl to Mori Sensei, he professed that Kamoda had no influence on him whatsoever. And here he is making this bowl in porcelain with polychrome overglaze enamel. And what can I say? It's transparent. Then there's Kamoda's influence in the region from where he worked. In the Tochigi, Ibaraki, and Iwate area, there's a whole generation of male artists who clearly derive from the impact of this favorite son. You have Ito Tadashi, who works his surfaces very much in the way the early Kamoda works from 1968 and 69 are. Or you have the young Sawada Hayato, new up-and-coming star from Mashko, where if you look at the mouth and how that patterning is wrapped around the vessel and all the angles and the interior and exterior space being a seamless continuity is definitely in the Kamoda tradition. And then you have Iguchi Daisuke, who I would say is truly the heir apparent to the early Kamoda work, working in Moka, not far from Mashiko. And even in, it's sort of a hard slide to see at the far left in the lower corner, even his patterning in this sort of banded way, very painstakingly applied, to me evokes the enamel work of Kamoda from the 1970s. And his use of metallic glazes and scraping off the surface of the clay to reveal this dark gray clay for which the Tono region is renowned. And now I'm going to bring two artists who you would not necessarily think of when you think of Kamoda, but I would argue, and Sakayama would probably disagree with me, but he's a student of Yanagihara, who is a student of Tomimoto, so he's the third generation. And it's hard not to look at Sakayama's work and not look at this apogee of Japanese ceramics that you see on the right. And I want to point your attention to the work on the right. Shirley will relate to this, and maybe Matthew in your comments, it was perfect. This is the one that got away. This was a work I've always coveted, and there was a dealer named Skada Haruyoshi who had a gallery called Gallery Mukyo in Tokyo, and he was as passionate about Kamoda as I was. And my red, green, and white vase came from him, and the piece that Aaron focused on with the enamel circular pattern came from him. And this was his work. And every year, twice a year, I'd go visit him and say, will you sell me this piece? Will you sell me this piece? I couldn't get it because he basically, to be honest, he had to die. He was never going to let this piece go. And then his brother sold it to the Museum of Modern Art Kyoto. And I have to say, that's a very good place for it. I get to visit it. But believe me, it's painful every time I see this piece. This is the piece that got away. And probably I couldn't have afforded it anyway, but I wanted to at least be offered this piece. And the last one I want to show you, which you would never expect to see in this discussion, is my beloved friend, Kondo Takahiro. And here you see a work by Kamoda, an aberrant work. I beg you, can you find another work by him with a metallic beaded glaze? And I would argue no. But I actually bought this piece from Kondo Takahiro. This was in his collection. Wow. And you just never know where the grandson of porcelain Sometsuke blue and white artists can find inspiration from the work of an artist in Tono working with very simple stoneware in a totally different firing and a different aesthetic completely from that of his ancestors. So one never knows. And I want to close with a note that just came in today. As a collector and as a dealer, I sent off copies of the catalog, thank you, Matthew, to many of my collectors who could not come to Minnesota and whose works were not included in the show due to many factors, mostly economic. And I sent this piece to this collector whose husband is in frail health. And she wrote back in a handwritten note, Kamoda Shōji is off the charts wonderful for me. To look at my two pieces and to peruse this book is to dispel the gloom of this pandemic. It is truly heartwarming. So thank you, Matthew, for bringing joy to so many people and enabling us to be here tonight and for me to partner with Mia. It's a great joy. And I look forward to many opportunities of visiting my children in your wonderful museum. Thank you.
Terrific. Thank you, Joan. And please know you all are welcome. Again, April 17th is the final day for the exhibition, and look forward to seeing you in Minneapolis. I wanted to thank all of our panelists and turn to our Q&A, but before doing so, I wanted to remind you that the catalog is available through the museum's website. You can follow the link that you see here. And I also wanted to call out that a major contributor to this catalog was Satoshi Yokobori at the Mashiko Museum of Ceramic Arts. this publication would not be nearly as enriching and beautiful were it not for his help. He really came to the rescue in helping us locate many of the all of the black and white photos that you see in the book, as well as some of the comparative images. And so he also, of course, contributed a remarkable essay to the book. So I'm not sure if Mr. Yokobori is with us this evening, but he was an integral part to the formation of this exhibition and this catalog. So I'm seeing a few questions in the Q&A. One is has to do with, for the panelists, I'll turn this over to the panelists, Kamoda's relationship with Ezaki Issei. Any insights from our panelists?
Louise, do you know how Aoyama Green Gallery put those three men together? I don't really know.
I hadn't known about their collaboration until you spoke of it, Joan. But
oh, okay.
Ezaki Issei, working in Tokoname, certainly was working with reduction firing and green ash glaze, the same combination of materials that Kamoda was using in his early phase. And I can imagine they just had lots to say to one another. But beyond that, I don't know. I'm intrigued too. And how Mori Togaku got in there, that's another mystery.
The Yagi family, Yagi, the husband and wife who ran that gallery, were very pioneering people who really thought outside the box. And many of the shows at Green Gallery and Aoyama Green Gallery were the cutting edge of contemporary clay in Japan at the time. So I'm guessing that they threw these three men together because they had literally nothing in common, in a sense. And like, okay, let's lay down the gauntlet and let's see what you can do together. And clearly it had an impression on Mori Togaku that he denies. When you see some of his faceted early work, Mori Togaku, that's very modernist and not what he's doing really Muromachi style work that is re-evoking the aesthetics of ancient Bizen. But at that point in his career, he was perhaps more liberated from the yoke of Bizen tradition and was willing to experiment. And being at Aoyama Green Gallery, which is not like being in a local Bizen focused gallery, and being in Tokyo, he was able to do that. Issei, he didn't change that much in my recollection. It's sort of ladle poured ash glaze on stoneware, large platters, very dramatic. Some of you who own Madame Kikuchi's book, Japan Ceramics Today, or Fred Bakeland's catalog on Japanese ceramics in American collections will be familiar with his work. And in a sense, I think Kamoda did that work better, you know, about that little bit before that point in time. But it's an interesting trio.
Yeah, if I can add one more thought that you bring to mind, Joan. Now I'm remembering that in the Sackler collection is a very early Mori Togaku piece that, like a lot of Kamoda's jar shapes, shows, as Andy Maskey commented in a passing comment earlier this evening, a lot of looking at jars of the late Jomon Yayoi period with their asymmetrical shapes and their irregular rims. And the one jar by Mori Togaku in the Sackler collection is that kind of jar, small, with a intentionally asymmetrical mouth. So now that you mentioned that, I can imagine it's from possibly that very moment when he and Kamoda were talking a lot, looking at one another's work.
Thank you. There's a question about the type of clay that Kamoda used. I think we've referred to it briefly here, but Aaron, would you like to take that?
Sure. Until 68, someone please correct me if I misspeak, but until 68 he was using a variety of clays. But beginning in 68, he turns to Tono clay that he learned about on a trip over that summer. And then when he moves in 69, he primarily uses Tono clay, but not exclusively. he certainly is using other materials as well.
Yeah. And the characteristics of tono clay?
So it's sandy, right? It's sort of full of minerals and other things. According to Kamoda's own students who report on sort of what it was like to use this clay, it was essentially unusable on a wheel, right? He had to turn to hand-built forms then in '68, which is when we start to see that plate, for example, and the faceted purple vessel. So the clay makes, I mean, it forces him in that direction, and it changes his career, the trajectory of his career in that moment, I think.
Yeah, I think some of the most interesting pieces for me have both that sort of dual, very finely applied decoration, but with surface blooms from the inclusions in the clay.
Yeah, the piece that I keep talking about with the bubbles, for example, there's this incredible, if you get up close to it, I mean, you see this pitted, pockmarked, sort of pinkish surface, orangish surface next to this brilliant, these brilliant enamel bands, for example. It's beautiful.
Right. Yeah. And so there was another question about methods informing the vessels. And I think, Aaron, you've now mentioned it. Most of them are hand-built. There was also, let's see, Joan, are there any women ceramic artists who were following Kamoda Shōji, or is it largely a men's club?
Interesting question. My experience is it's largely a men's club because it's so focused on vessel, and the leading women are a little more not tied to the functionality of ceramics. But the unity of interior and exterior space, I could look at, let's say, the work of Kitamura Junko, who comes from the Kondo Yutaka line in Kyoto, who comes from Kondo Yuzo, who comes from Kamoda. It's like looking at a big family tree. But the way she, even though her work is Pungchong style, punctuated patterning, but the way she runs her patterning through the mouth, over the piece, and then to the base, and how she allows her patterns to almost serendipitously end or commence or recommence, that kind of staccato patterning, I would say, is an extension of Kamoda's influence, and not that of her teacher, Kondo Yutaka. I'm sure there are others if I think about it. It's just that many of the men I mentioned also tended to move to the north of Japan from their Kyoto training. There was like an exodus. If you were in that mode, you had to go live in the right place, and you had to use the right materials and be in the right climate to truly recreate the Kamoda mode, if you will. And that's not where I think I have almost one or two women artists working there, and they are not from that tradition at all. But maybe some of those in the Kyoto region would more aptly fit. Good question.
So another question is quite interesting from Andy Maskey, and that is, Kamoda died tragically quite young. Has his family, his wife and children, played any significant role in his legacy as an artist? And are there known archives of his belongings, such as his working notes or library, other shirio such as that?
Well, now you need Yokobori sensei, who's not here with us, but his son is a potter, and his son is definitely perpetuating the Kamoda aesthetic. And I'm sure some people in our audience may be trolling on the web and they think they found a Kamoda Shōji piece, but it's by his son. It's very closely allied to the art of his father. His widow is still alive, and she is sort of the keeper of the flame. And so if a work by Kamoda turns up on the market, boxless, if you will, she's the one to provide the authentication for that work. And honestly, there are many forgeries of Kamoda work on the market. So her role could be seen as being important for boxless works. And as to his archives, I really don't know. I know Matsubara sensei at the Kyoto National Museum, by doing the show, was hoping to get them, but it's Japan. I don't know how that played out. And I'm sure Yokobori, being the man of the region and the man who's done more shows on Kamoda than anyone else would be the likely beneficiary and keeper in the Mashiko Messe Museum, but I don't really know. Louise, do you know?
I don't know. It's an interesting question. I agree with you. Mashiko seems to be the logical place.
Yeah.
There are plenty of Kyoto artists who need to have their archives archived in Kyoto.
Yeah. Just from my experience in helping with the catalog and reaching out to Yokobori-san for images, the Mashiko Museum of Ceramic Art seems to be a repository. It seems as if materials are making their way there, and he mounts Kamoda shows at a fantastic rate. So I think that people associate that institution with Kamoda and send material as they find it. There was a question about the kiln that I mentioned early on, a climbing kiln. I think you're referring to the climbing kiln operated by Richard Bresnahan. It's the so-called Johanna kiln, named after his mentor at a Benedictine monastery there. He constructed it in 1994. The first firing was in 1995. It's 87 feet long, holds some 12,000 ceramic objects on firing. It takes 10 days to fire and 60 volunteers. So a massive undertaking that usually happens every other year in the autumn. I think we've just about reached our time. I want to again thank our panelists and particularly our participants for tuning in. Once again, it's been illuminating, I think, for all of us. Appreciate everyone's comments and questions. And again, thank you so much for tuning in.
Thank you all. It was wonderful. I see that, I'm not sure if people are still listening. As you look here, you will see what our gallery is up to for the next month. I don't know how we're going to possibly get all this done, but we have the delayed Winter Antique Show where we're doing an exhibition on Kazari. We have Kondo Takehiro's show Making Waves, his new work from 2021 that prefaces the big national tour of his and his family's work that will be traveling the United States starting in 1923 and actually go to Mia. Maybe 2024. It's hard to keep track of this busy show. And we'll be doing a panel with Kondo Takehiro virtually present next month. Stay tuned for the date. I think it's going to be the 17th on St. Patrick's Day. And we'll have Joe Earl and Glenn Adamson as participants on that panel. So I think we'll all have a good time. So thank you all for joining us tonight. And my panelists, for me, Kamoda is such a passion and such an important part of my life. I love sharing it with you all and hearing all your insights. I learn more every day. Take care, everyone, and hopefully we'll see you in New York in person during Asia Week, New York. We're hoping it's going to be virus-free and very festive with lots of exhibitions and auctions galore at all 5 auction houses. So come to New York. We look forward to greeting you in person. And thank you very much. Good night, everyone.